Hello there. Is it normal these days to be able to speak your mind openly, to practice one's religion without fearing reprisals, to demonstrate peacefully, to be open about your individual sexual orientation, and to be able to live according to it, to vote under democratic conditions, being able to find out about independent press coverage, or pursue a profession of your choice? That means to really be free. Regrettably, this is not the case in many countries around the world. The number of actually free and democratic societies in the world, according to a confirmed impression, seems to be, let's say, dwindling. It's all the more important to stand up for our pluralistic form of society, to respect it, to strengthen it through state structures, and to protect it where it is attacked by anti-constitutional efforts or threatens to be undermined. The German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution is based in Cologne and reports to the Federal Ministry of the Interior. Its task is to protect the basic democratic order of the Federal Republic of Germany as laid down in the Constitution, the Grundgesetz. However, the office has no powers like the police, but rather its employees collect and evaluate information about suspicious anti-constitutional activities. These can come, for example, from a right-wing or left-wing extremist group that is openly opposed to the democratic order and thus wants to endanger the reputation and the existence of our country. I always say our and we because I am German. The main tasks of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution are the observation and prevention of terrorist activities, protection against political and economic espionage, and defense against sabotage attacks. Other areas of activity include monitoring the right-wing extremist party NPD, Islamist groups, or the Scientology sect, which are suspected of violating the constitution, but also parts of the Left Party and the AfD. Every year, the Federal Office publishes a report for the protection of the constitution, in which an account of the activities is given. A control body of the German Bundestag, the federal parliament, monitors and checks the work of the BFV, as we call them, as well as that of the other German secret services like the MAD, the Military Shield Service, or the BND, that's the Federal Intelligence Service. The end of the Second World War on May 8, 1945, and the associated defeat of Germany, as well as the Allied occupation, formed the basis for the democratic reconstruction of Germany. The lessons learned from the experiences of the Weimar Republic and the National Socialist dictatorship soon had corresponding effects. First of all, the Control Council Law No. 31 of July 1946 prohibited the occupying powers from now on any monitoring or control of political activities by German police stations. In addition, it became clear to the Parliamentary Council, which was supposed to draft the basic law, the Constitution for the Federal Republic of Germany in 1948 and 49, also under the impression of the escalating conflict between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, how real the danger of the advance of totalitarian states based on tyranny still was. It was decided to make provisions in the future constitution and in individual laws to combat and ward off political extremism. The political system of the Federal Republic of Germany should be designed as a defensive democracy. The Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution followed the decision of the mothers and fathers of the Federal Republic of Germany for a value-based constitution that was to be effectively defended against their enemies. The founding phase in particular was controlled down to the last detail by the Western Allied occupying powers. In the so-called police letter of April 1949, the Allied military governors allowed the future federal government to set up its own office to collect and disseminate information about subversive activities directed against the federal government. At the same time, however, they forbade granting this authority police powers. As already indicated before, this shows the prevailing leitmotif in the emergence of the protection of the Constitution. A new Gestapo was to be prevented by all means. It was the birth of the so-called separation requirement as a principle of German law, according to which the police and the intelligence services should be separated in terms of tasks, organization, powers, and also data processing. The Basic Law, our Constitution of May 1949, then consistently took up the possibilities granted by the Allies and provided for a separate central office for the collection of documents for the purposes of the protection of the Constitution, as it was called that time. In September 1950, the Act on Cooperation between the Federation and the States in matters of the protection of the Constitution was promulgated. This law obliged the federal and state governments to set up their own constitutional protection authorities. The federal government complied with this obligation by setting up the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution in November 1950, with the states following at different intervals. The Federal Constitutional Protection Act of 1950 initially consisted of only 6 paragraphs, which, however, were limited to organizational regulations and tasks. At the working level, the first task was to protect the Federal Republic against attempts to overthrow by left-wing or right-wing extremists. Because the tragic end of the Weimar Republic and its devastating consequences until the end of the war was a collective traumatic experience that could not be ignored as a burden for the future. The neo-Nazi Socialist Reich Party was banned in 1952, and a little later the German Communist Party was banned by the Federal Constitutional Court in 1956 in the early years of the Federal Republic. The decision to create a value-based, vigilant and defensive democracy with the Basic Law and to implement a comprehensive constitutional protection system is also reflected in the constitutional protection laws of the federal and state governments. A key task of the protection of the Constitution at the federal and state levels is the monitoring of efforts directed against the free democratic basic order. And the free democratic basic order as an indefinite legal term does not mean the Constitution or the Basic Law in its entirety, but the unchangeable highest value principles as the core of our democratic system. According to Section 3 of the Federal Constitutional Protection Act, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution collects information about aspirations that are against the free democratic basic order or are directed against the existence and security of the federal government or a state, or endanger foreign interests of the Federal Republic of Germany through the use of force or preparatory actions aimed at this, or are directed against the idea of international understanding, that's one of our principles, in particular against the peaceful coexistence of peoples. And the Secret Service activities for foreign power, that means counterintelligence is also their job, and they evaluate this. Furthermore, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution is involved in the protection of secrets and sabotage in accordance with the Federal Constitutional Protection Act. According to the Federal Constitutional Protection Act, they also have some fundamental value principles. That one is the right of the people to exercise state power in elections and votes and through special legislative, executive and judicial organs, and to elect the people's representatives in general in a direct, free, equal and secret election. And the binding of legislation to the constitutional order and the binding of executive power and judiciary to law and justice. Another value is the right to form and exercise a parliamentary opposition, and the detachability of the government and its responsibility towards the people's representatives, and the independence of the courts, and the exclusion of any violent and despotic rule, and the human rights specified in the Basic Law. Definitions of terms that are largely congruent in terms of content can also be found in the state constitutional protection laws. Radical views also have their place in a lively democratic discourse. In fact, it is legitimate to express one's opinion that one considers democracy to be the wrong form of government or that capitalism as an economic and social form and the social market economy as an economic and socio-political model are misguided. That's your right. The Basic Law only recognizes the obligation to comply with the law, but not loyalty to values. An exception here are persons who are in the opposition of judge, soldier, or civil servant, and who have a duty to hold opinions and convictions in accordance with the Constitution. While I was an Air Force officer, I couldn't have made these videos. Radical views of critical citizens do not give the Office for the Protection of the Constitution any reason to take action. They fall under freedom of expression, are an expression of political participation, and are therefore protected by the free democratic basic order. Relevance for the protection of the Constitution always arises when the boundary is crossed from a radical opinion to an extremist effort. That means behavior is shown that amounts to an impairment or elimination of the basic state structure. If individuals or groups act against the free democratic order or even plan attacks against the background of extremist convictions, it is the most urgent task of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution to obtain and evaluate information about this, openly or covertly, in order to forward it to the responsible authorities and to effectively avert danger. The Office for the Protection of the Constitution is already active when the police are not yet responsible. It is therefore the effective early warning system to protect our democratic community from impairments, and that's why it's important that it's there. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.